The woman in charge of the agency for distressed gentlewomen had a voice like dry rusk crumbling. "The Duke of Blackwood requires a wife," she announced to the room of grey-clad women, her tone suggesting he might as well have ordered a sack of potatoes. A tremor of shock, of fear, passed through the assembled governesses and companions. The Duke of Blackwood was a name spoken in whispers, a creature of rumour and shadow who had not been seen in London society for nearly a decade. They said he was scarred, that he was mad, that his fortune was built on ruthlessness, and his heart was a stone. Evelina Hayes felt nothing. Numbness was a mercy, a thick blanket packed around the raw wound of her betrayal. She sat on a hard-backed chair, her hands folded over the only decent dress she owned, and listened to the litany of his requirements. The Duchess will be expected to manage a large household with utmost efficiency. She must be possessed of a quiet temperament. She must understand that her role is administrative, not social. There will be no sentiment. The arrangement is a contract, for the purpose of securing the Blackwood line and satisfying the entail of his father's will. The woman paused, her eyes sweeping over the pale, anxious faces. "The Duke offers a generous settlement, a title, and complete security. In return, he demands absolute, unquestioning obedience." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of calculation. For the women in this room, security was a dream as distant as a star. But obedience to a monster? The agency director continued, her voice sharpening. "He is a man of precise habits and no patience. He expects his home to run as a well-oiled machine. He does not abide frivolity, noise, or emotional displays." It was the final phrase, delivered with such sterile finality, that broke through Evelina's stupor. Emotional displays, as if a heart were a misbehaving child to be sent to its room. She thought of her stepmother's theatrical weeping while signing away Evelina's inheritance. She thought of her fiancé Julian's passionate declarations of love, spoken a week before he cast her aside like a worn-out glove. The sheer, breathtaking absurdity of this cold-blooded transaction, this bartering for a human machine, struck her as the most honest thing she had heard in months. A single, sharp sound escaped her lips. It was not a giggle or a titter. It was a laugh, a pure, helpless bark of disbelief that cut through the stuffy air of the agency like a shard of glass. Every head turned. The director's face went rigid with horror. In the doorway, a shadow moved. A man had been standing there, unnoticed, his presence so absolute it seemed to absorb the light. He was tall, dressed in severe black, his face a landscape of harsh planes and angles. A scar, pale and silver, cut down from his left temple, narrowly missing his eye, and ending at the hard line of his jaw. It was him. The Duke of Blackwood. His eyes, the colour of a winter storm, were fixed on her. The room held its breath, waiting for the explosion. He took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Evelina's face. He moved with a predator's economy, silent and deliberate. He stopped directly in front of her chair, forcing her to crane her neck to look up at him. "You," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "You find my terms amusing." Evelina's heart hammered against her ribs, but the strange, reckless honesty that had seized her did not recede. "I find them preposterous," she managed, her own voice steadier than she expected. To demand a machine and not expect the occasional squeak of protest is an oversight in engineering. A collective gasp went through the room. The Duke's scarred face remained impassive, but something flickered in the depths of his grey eyes. For a long moment he simply looked at her, his assessment so intense it felt physical. He was not looking at her worn dress or her tired face. He was looking through her into the architecture of her bones, the metal of her spirit. Then he turned his head slightly toward the petrified agency director. "This one," he said, the words falling like stones into the silence. She will do. If you believe a single moment can change a life, subscribe for more stories like this. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. 3 weeks prior, Evelina Hayes had a home, a fiancé, and a future. Or so she had been led to believe. Her life had been one of quiet, unacknowledged competence. After her mother's death, her father had married Lady Ashworth, a woman whose charm was a thin veneer over a core of grasping ambition. It was Evelina, with her keen mind for numbers and strategy, who had managed the sprawling, debt-ridden Ashworth estate. She spent her nights with the ledgers, her days negotiating with tenants and suppliers, slowly, painstakingly turning the tide of insolvency. Her stepmother took the credit, preening in London drawing rooms about her own financial acumen. Evelina's work was her purpose, a silent engine humming beneath the floorboards of the grand house. Her reward was to be an engagement to Lady Ashworth's son, Julian. Julian was handsome, polished, and possessed of a cruelty that he mistook for strength. He called her his clever little mouse, patting her head when she presented him with a renegotiated contract that saved them hundreds of pounds. The marriage was a business transaction, meant to formally join the estate she managed to the family name that would own it. She had accepted it with the same practicality she applied to everything. Love was a luxury. Survival was a necessity. The only true warmth in that house came from her young half-sister Clara, a gentle soul who saw the kindness beneath Evelina's reserved exterior. "You make the house work, Evie," Clara would whisper, slipping her a cup of tea late at night in the study. "They would be lost without you." And they were. After her father's sudden death from a fever, the pretense dropped away. The betrayal was swift and brutal. Lady Ashworth and Julian summoned her to the study, her study, the room where she had saved them. On the desk were papers she herself had prepared, documents she believed were to secure a new loan to fund crop improvements. Instead, they were sale agreements. They had sold the entire estate, its lands, its tenants, everything, to a faceless London consortium. "The debts were simply too great, my dear," Lady Ashworth said, dabbing at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "We had to salvage what we could." Julian stood by the fireplace, buffing his nails, a smirk playing on his lips. "My mother and I are moving to a townhouse in Mayfair, a much more suitable arrangement." The unspoken truth hung in the air. With the estate gone, Evelina was no longer a necessary component of the transaction. "Our engagement," Julian said, not even bothering to look at her, "is, of course, dissolved. It would be inappropriate under the circumstances." They cast her out that same afternoon with a single carpet bag and 10 shillings for her years of labour. The last thing she saw was Clara's face at an upstairs window, her small hand pressed against the glass, her expression one of helpless sorrow. Evelina walked down the long gravel drive, the home she had saved receding behind her, and did not look back. The numbness set in on the coach to London, a welcome frost killing the pain. She was not a person anymore, she was a problem to be solved. And the first step to solving it was finding a place like the Agency for Distressed Gentlewomen. The Duke's carriage was as severe and silent as its owner. Upholstered in dark grey wool, it moved through the London streets with an unnerving smoothness, insulating her from the chaos of the city. Evelina sat opposite a man who was now, by some bewildering twist of fate, her fiancé. The Duke had not spoken a word since leaving the agency. He simply sat, his long frame filling the space, and watched the rain-streaked city pass by the window. The silence was not empty, it was dense, a physical presence in the carriage. Evelina found it strangely calming. It was an honest silence, unlike the chattering, deceptive silences of her former life. They travelled for hours, leaving the city behind for the rolling hills of the countryside. As dusk settled, they turned onto a private road, flanked by ancient, gnarled oaks that formed a canopy overhead. At the end of the road stood Blackwood Manor. It was not a house, it was a fortress. A vast Gothic edifice of dark grey stone, its mullioned windows like vacant eyes staring out over a landscape of stark, wind-swept beauty. There were no welcoming lights, no sign of life, only the crunch of the carriage wheels on the gravel drive. A footman opened the door, and the air that met them was cold, smelling of stone and damp earth and something else, disuse. Inside the great hall was a cavern of shadows, the flagstones echoing with their footsteps. A woman stood waiting at the base of a sweeping stone staircase, her hands clasped before her. She was tall and thin, her grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her face taut. "Your Grace," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "Mrs. Croft." The Duke acknowledged with a nod. "This is Miss Hayes. She will be the new Duchess. See to her needs." Mrs. Croft's gaze flickered over Evelina, a quick, dismissive appraisal of her worn dress and single bag. There was no welcome in her eyes, only a grim acceptance of a new and unwelcome duty. A young maid with wide, curious eyes, Elspeth, Evelina would later learn, was summoned to show her to her rooms. The suite was enormous, opulent, and utterly frigid. A fire had been laid in the grate, but not lit. The vast canopied bed looked as inviting as a marble slab. After a solitary meal of cold meat and bread was delivered on a tray, Evelina was left alone in the echoing silence of her new life. An hour later, there was a sharp knock. It was the Duke. He stood in the doorway, a black silhouette against the candle-lit corridor. "May I have a word?" he asked. It was not a question. He walked to the unlit fireplace, his presence dwarfing the room. He did not invite her to sit. He began to speak, his tone the same one a man might use to discuss crop yields. "I will be plain, Miss Hayes. I require a duchess to fulfill the terms of an entail. A wife in name, to manage this house and bear a legitimate heir. That is the extent of the position." He paused, his grey eyes pinning her. "In return, you will have the protection of my name, a title, and financial resources beyond anything you have known. You will have your own rooms, your own accounts, your own life within these walls. You will want for nothing, materially." He turned to face the cold hearth. "What I will not offer is companionship. I will not offer affection, and I will not, under any circumstances, offer love. My first wife taught me the folly of such things. This is a contract. Do you understand its terms?" Evelina looked at this stark, damaged man, and saw not a monster, but a reflection of her own weariness. He was offering her a fortress just as cold and imposing as his house, but safe. Safety was more than she had dared hope for. The honesty of his coldness was a balm compared to the poison of Julian's feigned affection. Cold indifference was survivable. Active cruelty was not. "I understand the terms perfectly, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and even, "and I accept them." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Not surprise, perhaps, but a grudging respect. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive gesture. "Very well. We will be married by special license on Friday." He turned and left, closing the door behind him, leaving her alone in the cold, silent heart of Blackwood Manor. Evelina did not languish in her gilded cage. To be idle was to allow the ghosts of her past to whisper in her ear, and she would not permit it. On her third morning as the Duchess of Blackwood, she sought out Mrs. Croft. The housekeeper received her in a small, meticulously ordered office, her posture as rigid as the ledgers bound in black leather on her shelves. "I require the household accounts for the past year," Evelina stated, her tone polite but firm. A flicker of surprise, then suspicion, crossed Mrs. Croft's severe features. "His Grace has always left such matters to me." "His Grace now has a duchess," Evelina replied evenly. "And the Duchess intends to understand the mechanics of her home. The ledgers, if you please." A silent battle of wills was fought and won in the space of 10 seconds. Mrs. Croft, unaccustomed to being challenged by anyone save the Duke himself, retrieved the heavy books. For the next week, Evelina worked. She sat not in the grand, unused drawing-room, but at a small desk in the corner of the vast, chilly library, poring over the numbers. The estate was not mismanaged. Mrs. Croft was too efficient for that, but it was run with a startling lack of economy. Suppliers from London charged exorbitant rates for goods that could be sourced locally for half the price. Staffing schedules were inefficient, with too many hands idle for half the day. The estate was bleeding money through 1,000 small, unnecessary cuts. Armed with her findings, she did not ask the Duke for permission. She drafted a new budget, a list of recommended local suppliers, and a revised staff rota. She requested a meeting, and, in the same library where they now spent most evenings in shared silence, she laid out her plans. Alistair, he had insisted she call him by his given name in private. A strange intimacy in their sterile arrangement, listened without interruption, his scarred face betraying no emotion as he examined her neat columns of figures. He had expected a quiet, decorative object to satisfy the terms of the entail. He had acquired, it seemed, a quartermaster. When she finished, he looked up from the papers, his grey eyes searching her face. "You have done this before," he stated. It was not a question. "I have," she confirmed. "Mrs. Croft will not approve." "Mrs. Croft is a loyal servant of this house," Evelina said. "Her loyalty is to its preservation. When she sees the benefits, she will approve." He gave a short, sharp nod. "Proceed." And so she did. She began to inhabit the house, not as a guest, but as its mistress. She walked its silent corridors, her footsteps a new, steady rhythm in the oppressive quiet. She discovered the source of its melancholy. The entire west wing was shuttered and draped in dust cloths, a sealed tomb within the living house. She found the gardens, a once beautiful expanse now choked with weeds and tangled, thorny rose bushes that grew like grasping claws. The staff, who had at first treated her with the same wary distance they afforded the Duke, began to change. They saw her speaking with the head gardener about restoring the parterres. They heard her renegotiating with the butcher from the village, her voice calm and reasonable but unyielding. They noticed the quality of the food in the servants' hall improve. Elspeth, the young maid, began to smile at her, leaving a hot cup of tea on her desk without being asked. Mrs. Croft's reports became less about household matters and more like a military briefing, delivered to a commanding officer she had come to respect. Alistair watched it all. Evelina would feel his presence and look up to find him standing in the library doorway or on the landing of the grand staircase, simply observing her. His expression was always unreadable, a mask of controlled stillness. Yet she felt his attention as a constant low hum of energy in the house. Their evenings in the library became a ritual. They would sit in armchairs on opposite sides of the hearth, a crackling fire between them, and read for hours without speaking. The silence was no longer empty. It was companionable. One night, looking up from her book, she found him staring into the flames, the firelight catching the silver of his scar. A profound loneliness emanated from him, a sorrow so deep it seemed to have settled into his bones. On impulse, she rose and poured him a glass of brandy from the decanter on a side table, placing it on the small table beside his chair. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice rough. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a turning point, a quiet acknowledgement that the terms of their cold contract were beginning to fray at the edges. The West Wing drew her in. It was a place of secrets, a palpable void in the heart of the manor. Mrs. Croft deflected all questions about it with a pursed-lipped finality, stating only that it had been sealed on the Duke's orders years ago. Curiosity was a luxury Evelina had long suppressed, but here it bloomed like a stubborn weed. One afternoon, while reviewing linen inventories with a junior maid, she noticed a small, ornate brass key left on a console table near the corridor leading to the wing. The maid, flustered, had forgotten it. On an impulse Evelina could not explain, she slipped the key into her pocket. Later that day, when the house was quiet, she returned. The key slid into the lock of the great double doors with a well-oiled click. The air that met her as she pushed the door open was stale and thick with the scent of dust and dried lavender. The wing was a preserved moment in time. Furniture was draped in white dust cloths like shrouded ghosts. It was the domain of the first Duchess, Adela. Evelina walked through the silent rooms, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. It was a suite of breathtaking opulence, a stark contrast to the rest of the manor's austerity. In a small, sun-filled sitting room, she found a lady's writing desk, its surface clear save for a single silver letter opener. She ran her fingers over the cool, smooth wood. She was not looking for anything in particular, merely trying to understand the woman who had inflicted the wound Alistair still carried. She tried the drawers. The top two were empty. The bottom one was locked. Using the tip of the letter opener, she gently worked the simple lock until it sprang open. Inside, beneath a stack of perfumed letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, was a slim leather folio. Evelina lifted it out. It was not a diary, but a collection of business correspondence. Her breath caught in her throat. The letters detailed a series of systematic betrayals. Adela had been in collusion with Alistair's most bitter industrial rival, selling information, leveraging his assets for her own gain. It was a portrait of calculated, venomous treachery. But it was a name at the bottom of a deed of loan that made the blood drain from Evelina's face. Lord Ashworth. Her own father. The documents laid out a devastating truth. Years ago, Adela, in her web of deceit, had involved Lord Ashworth in a risky speculation that had failed spectacularly, leaving him deeply in her debt. When Alistair had unravelled his wife's schemes after she fled with her lover, he had been forced to acquire all the associated debts to consolidate his own financial position. Among them was the mortgage on the Ashworth estate. He had held her family's fate in his hands for years. A cold dread washed over her. Her selection at the agency, it had not been random. It was not her laugh, not her defiance. It was a calculated business decision. He had known precisely who she was, known of her competence from his own inquiries into the estate he effectively owned. He hadn't rescued a distressed gentlewoman. He had acquired an asset, a duchess who came with leverage over the very people who had wronged her. The cold, honest contract he had offered her was just another ledger entry. She was a pawn in a long, patient game of power and revenge she hadn't even known was being played. The fragile trust that had begun to grow in the quiet library, the shared silences, the small courtesies, it all shattered, turning to ice in her veins. She felt a fool, twice betrayed by men who saw her only as a piece on a board. She closed the folio, her hands trembling slightly, and walked out of the silent, dust-filled rooms, the truth a cold, heavy weight in her hands. That evening, the library felt different. The comforting warmth of the fire seemed a pretense, the companionable silence a lie. Evelina waited until Alistair had settled into his chair with a book. Then she walked to the heavy oak table between them and placed the leather folio upon its polished surface. The sound it made was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a gunshot. Alistair looked up, his eyes going from her face to the folio. He recognized it instantly. A muscle feathered in his jaw, the only sign of his tension. "You have been in the West Wing," he stated, his voice flat. "I have." she replied, her own voice dangerously calm. "And I have been reading about my father's poor business decisions." She did not need to elaborate. She watched his face, searching for a crack in the stone, some sign of guilt or deceit. He closed his book, placing it carefully aside. The control in the small movement was immense. "You believe I chose you as some form of collateral, another asset to be managed." "The thought had occurred to me," she said, the words clipped and sharp. He rose from his chair and walked to the fireplace, turning his back to her. For a long moment he stared into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, roughened with an emotion she could not name. "When my first wife left, she did not merely steal my money, she stole my judgment. She used my trust as a weapon against me. I swore I would never be that blind again. So yes, I investigate, I learn, I arm myself with knowledge." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was not of a calculating businessman, but of a man laid bare. "I learned that the Ashworth estate was being run into the ground by fools, but was being held together by the sheer force of will of an intelligent, unseen woman. I learned that woman had been betrayed and cast out with nothing. When I walked into that agency, I was not looking for a debtor's daughter. I was looking for a survivor. I was looking for someone whose character had been tested by fire." He took a step toward her. "Your laugh. It was not an insult. It was the sound of a spirit that refused to be broken. I chose you for your strength, Evelina, not your father's weakness. The debt was a circumstance. You were a choice." His honesty was a raw, painful thing. It did not erase the calculation, but it reframed it. The trust was still fractured, but perhaps not irreparably. Before she could process his words, the sound of a carriage arriving on the gravel drive cut through the night. A few moments later, the butler appeared at the library door, his expression deeply troubled. "Your Grace, a Mr. Julian Ashworth is here. He insists on seeing the Duchess." A cold fury, sharp and clean, sliced through Evelina's confusion. Julian. Here. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. He must have learned of her new position and come sniffing for opportunity. Alistair's face hardened into a mask of granite. He moved to stand slightly in front of her, a protective gesture as instinctual as breathing. "Show him into the hall, Jennings. I will deal with him." But Evelina placed a hand on his arm. "No," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "He came for me. I will deal with him." She swept past Alistair and walked into the great hall, her head held high. Julian stood there, looking absurdly pleased with himself, his fashionable coat looking garish and out of place against the hall's austere stone. He rushed forward, his face a mask of false concern. "Evelina, my dearest, I came as soon as I heard. Are you well? This brute, this monster, has he harmed you?" He reached for her hand. Evelina pulled back as if from a serpent. She looked at his handsome, weak face and felt nothing but contempt. "I am not your dearest, Julian," she said, her voice ringing with cold clarity in the echoing hall. "And I am perfectly well. I am the Duchess of Blackwood, by my own choice and consent." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "You have no business here. Your presence is an insult to my husband and to this house. You will leave now." Julian's face mottled with rage, his mask of concern falling away to reveal the spoiled, entitled bully beneath. "You are my property. You think this scarred gargoyle will keep you?" Before he could say more, Alistair was there, his shadow falling over Julian. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You heard my wife," he said, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "Leave, or you will be removed." Julian, for all his bluster, was a coward. He paled, took a stumbling step back, and practically fled from the house. Evelina stood watching the door close behind him, a tremor running through her. She had spoken back. She had claimed her own ground. She felt Alistair's presence behind her, solid and steady. They were not husband and wife. Not yet. But in that moment they were allies. The great hall remained silent after Julian's ignominious departure, the air still vibrating with the ugly confrontation. Alistair did not press her, did not speak. He simply waited until the trembling in Evelina's hands subsided, then gestured back toward the library. "The fire is warm," was all he said. She followed him back into the room, the scent of old paper and wood smoke a comforting familiarity. She sank into her customary chair, the adrenaline leaving her feeling hollowed out and weary. Alistair poured 2 glasses of brandy, handing one to her before taking his place opposite. For a long while they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the logs and the ticking of the grand clock in the hall. It was Alistair who finally broke the quiet. "Adela," he began, his voice low and devoid of its usual harsh edges. She hated the country. She hated this house. She called it my stone mausoleum. He stared into the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze turned inward. She hated my silences, and she despised this. He traced the line of the scar on his face with one finger, a souvenir from a skirmish in the colonies. She said it marred her aesthetic sensibilities. She filled the house with noise and people I couldn't abide, and when I retreated, she called me cold. Her betrayal, it was not just the money. It was the confirmation of a fear I had always held, that I was unlovable, a damaged, solitary creature best left alone. He looked up, and his eyes met Evelina's across the space between them. I sealed off the West Wing, and I sealed off myself along with it. I built a fortress of routine and silence because it was safe. The contract I offered you was part of that fortress, an honest transaction with no risk of a broken heart. Evelina listened, her own carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. She saw the immense vulnerability beneath his formidable exterior. She thought of her own life at the Ashworths, the crushing invisibility of her existence. "They never saw me," she said softly, the admission surprising her. "My stepmother saw a tool. Julian saw a stepping stone. They consumed my work, my mind, my energy, and never once acknowledged the person who provided it. I was a ghost in my own home. Here." She looked around the vast, shadowed library. "In all this space and all this silence, I have felt more solid, more real than I ever did there." He rose and came to stand before her chair. The firelight threw his tall frame into silhouette, but she could see the profound sincerity in his expression. "I did not offer you companionship," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "because I did not believe I had any left to give. I was wrong." He reached down, his hand hesitating for a moment, before he gently touched her face, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw. His touch was not possessive or demanding. It was questioning, tentative, and achingly tender. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than formal necessity, and a current of warmth spread through her, chasing away the last of the chill. In his eyes she saw not a duke, not a master of a contract, but a man hoping, against all his better judgment, for a reason to trust again. The wall of his own making, the one built from the ruins of his past, had finally, irrevocably fallen. The invitation arrived on a silver tray, its thick vellum and gold engraving a summons from a world Alistair had long abandoned. The annual St. James Masquerade, hosted by the formidable Duchess of Sutherland, was the pinnacle of the London season. To ignore it would be a social slight. To attend would be to formally present his new, mysterious Duchess to the wolves of the Tarn. Rumours had been swirling for weeks about the reclusive Duke of Blackwood's sudden marriage to a woman of no name and no fortune. Evelina knew with a sickening certainty that Julian and his mother would be there, ready to fan the flames of gossip and slander. "We don't have to go," Alistair said, watching her face as she read the invitation. "We do," she replied, her resolve hardening. "To hide is to admit we have something to hide." The night of the ball, Evelina stood before the mirror in her chambers while Elspeth fastened the last of the buttons on her gown. It was a creation of deep midnight blue silk, its cut simple and elegant, unadorned by the fussy lace and ribbons favoured by society. Her only ornament was a simple string of pearls Alistair had left for her, his only comment a terse note. "These belonged to my mother. They deserve to be worn by a woman of substance." When she descended the grand staircase, Alistair was waiting at the bottom. He was not in his usual severe black, but in formal evening attire that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. With a simple black mask covering his eyes, the scar was less prominent, drawing attention instead to the firm line of his mouth and the intensity of his gaze. He looked at her, and for a moment he was completely still. "Evelina," he breathed, the name a soft caress. He took her hand and placed it on his arm, his touch firm and reassuring. As they entered the glittering, chandelier-lit ballroom, a wave of whispers followed them. Evelina kept her head high, her gaze straight ahead, feeling Alistair's solid presence beside her. They were a striking, sombre island in a sea of colourful silks and frothy laughter. It was not long before Julian materialized, a smug, predatory smile on his face. He cornered them near a colonnade, his voice pitched to carry. "Duchess, a pleasure to see you, looking so well cared for." He bowed with mocking formality. "I do hope His Grace is treating you with the gentleness your delicate nature requires." The insinuation was clear. She was a fragile captive. Before Evelina could utter the cold retort that rose to her lips, Alistair spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the surrounding chatter like a knife, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. "My wife's nature," he said, his eyes fixed on Julian, "is anything but delicate. It is formidable." He turned his gaze to the assembled lords and ladies who were now openly listening. "You see before you the Duchess of Blackwood, but what you should see is the woman who, in 3 short months, has turned my estate from a place of loss into one of profit, the woman whose financial acumen exceeds that of any man in this room, the woman who governs my home and my life with a grace and intelligence I had thought lost to the world." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Alistair then produced a folded document from his coat pocket. He let it unfold with a crisp snap. "This is a notice of foreclosure. Due to years of gross mismanagement and fraud perpetrated by Mr. Julian Ashworth and his mother, I am, as of this morning, the legal owner of the Ashworth estate." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Julian's face turned the colour of spoilt milk. Alistair continued, his voice resonating with cold authority. "My wife, however, in her first official act as Duchess, has instructed me that the tenants and staff are to be protected from the consequences of Mr. Ashworth's folly. Her first thought was for the people her family betrayed. That is her nature." He folded the document and fixed Julian with a look of utter disdain. "You are a parasite, Ashworth, and you are no longer welcome in society." With that, he offered his arm to Evelina. She took it, and together they turned and walked through the parted crowd, leaving Julian utterly, publicly, and financially ruined. They had arrived as a mystery. They left as a power. Months later, the gardens of Blackwood Manor were transformed. Where once there had been a tangled wilderness of thorns and weeds, there were now neatly gravelled paths, vibrant flower beds, and meticulously pruned rose bushes heavy with the promise of summer blooms. It was Evelina's sanctuary, a testament to her patient, steady work. The restoration of the garden had mirrored the restoration of the house itself, which now felt less like a fortress and more like a home, its silences comfortable, its rhythms gentle. She was staking a climbing rose against a south-facing wall when Alistair found her. He approached not with his old, silent tread, but with a purposeful stride that she had come to know well. He watched her for a moment, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "You have brought this place back to life," he said, his voice warm in the morning air. "It only needed tending," she replied, snipping a stray vine. They walked together down a path lined with lavender, the scent rising in a fragrant cloud around them. The awkwardness that had once defined their interactions was long gone, replaced by an easy companionship that was more precious to Evelina than any jewel. He stopped and turned to her, taking her dirt-smudged hands in his own large, scarred ones. He looked down at their joined hands, then met her eyes, his gaze direct and filled with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "The contract I offered you was a document of fear," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "It was built on the ruins of my past, designed to protect me from ever feeling anything again. It was the work of a coward." Evelina's heart gave a painful lurch. She waited, holding her breath. "I was wrong about everything," he continued. "About myself, about what a marriage could be, about you." He lifted one of her hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I would like to propose new terms, Evelina." The seriousness in his tone made the world seem to stand still. The bird song, the breeze, the scent of the flowers, it all faded into the background, leaving only the two of them standing in the heart of the world they had rebuilt together. "New terms?" she whispered. He looked directly into her eyes, his own grey ones clear and certain. "Love," he said, the word spoken plainly, as a statement of fact. "Partnership. A home, for as long as you will have me." It was not a grand, poetic declaration. It was better. It was the simple, unvarnished truth, offered from the heart of a man who had thought his heart broken beyond repair. Tears welled in Evelina's eyes, but she was smiling. A true, radiant smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. She did not need to offer a grand acceptance. He already knew her answer. She simply tightened her grip on his hands, linking her fingers through his. "I accept the terms, Your Grace." "Alistair," he corrected, his voice thick with emotion. "Alistair," she repeated, the name a perfect, hopeful sound. He drew her close, and in the sunlit, blooming garden, surrounded by the life they had coaxed from neglected ground, he kissed his wife for the very first time. It was not the kiss of a contract, but the seal of a promise, a quiet beginning to a life that had, against all odds, found its way to love. Thank you for joining us on this journey to Blackwood Manor. Would you have accepted the Duke's cold contract? Let us know your thoughts and where you're watching from in the comments below. For in the end, the best alliances are not always the ones that begin in warmth, but the ones that grow toward it.